Recording has started. So I'd like to welcome Peter Mitchell for this talk this evening on exhumation and all things affiliated and attached around that. Peter, a huge thank you for joining us for the course to discuss this part of our course, the diploma. And this session will be sent on to all the students of the course. It will not be public information, only internally to the students. So a huge welcome, Peter, and thank you for joining us.
You're most welcome. So I've worked in bereavement services for 41 years, and since 2002 I've been an independent consultant. So I'm an expert in anything to do with burial, cremation and exhumation. However, most people are gripped by exhumation as opposed to the need for a new crematorium or a strategic review of cemeteries. They don't have quite that buzz. So I've got a presentation, I've got a lot of slides, a lot of pictures, not a lot of text. I'll rattle through it as reasonably quickly as I can, and I hope it's clear. So we're now going to try and flip over to, and I hope you can all see this. This is the first picture. Here lies in eternal peace our dear friend Marie, beloved by all. It's a very sweet inscription. And then here's an extract from Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard, dating from 1750. Beautiful poem. Beneath those rugged elms, that yew tree's shade, where heaves the turf in many a mouldering heap, each in his narrow cell forever laid, the rude forefathers of the hamlet sleep. So I've emboldened forever laid. So both slides sum up most people's attitude to burial of the dead, that the person rests in peace and that their body is there forever or until the second life that you may or may not believe in. But we're here to talk about why on earth would you exhume and what's involved in disturbing the resting peace of the deceased. There's all sorts of reasons, and I've split them up into single exhumations and multiple exhumations. Most of this stuff that I'm going to talk about, I have been responsible for managing the exhumation. Some of them I haven't been. Criminal investigation, whenever I meet people and exhumation comes up, oh, do you do that for the police? Most people think that exhumations only happen when there's a murder or something like that. They do happen sometimes, and I've done a number of them. For medical research, to establish the identity of the deceased, there's been a burial in a wrong grave. Then the more vague personal reasons and the even more vague miscellaneous. So let's just buzz through a few of these. So criminal investigation, here's an example with which I was involved. Detectives have revealed that the DNA of David Lace, whose remains were exhumed last month, matched those of the suspected killer of Teresa de Simone. As you know, the police have opened up cold cases going back many years because they now have the technical ability with DNA analysis, identification. So they suspected that this David Lace might be involved. We exhumed him. The DNA testing proved, yes, he was involved. The 22-year-old victim was found in her car at a pub in Southampton where she worked part-time in December 1979. And in fact, Sean Hodgson, aged 58, had spent 27 years in jail for a murder that he didn't commit before his conviction was quashed. And it was only quashed because we exhumed the real murderer, and that was disproved. Medical research, here's Phyllis Byrne. I've done a couple of exhumations for trying to find preserved tissues of people who died of Spanish flu. These exhumations all occurred before the COVID-19 pandemic, and Professor John Oxford was convinced at that time, and no doubt remains convinced, that we are going to have another flu pandemic. And he wanted to have preserved tissue of people who died of it. Here's another one, a rather famous chap, Sir Mark Sykes, destined to be a Prime Minister of Britain, a very important diplomat, an aristocrat. Bottom right is his house. Top right is one of the, I think it was 15 churches his family built. Bottom left is his gravestone. He died in France in the second wave of the Spanish flu. So we've done exhumations to facilitate medical research. Then to identify identity, Lydia Reeve believed that the remains of her son Gary, who died at the age of 7 days, were missing. She always believed that. She's now been proved correct. I wasn't involved in this one. This was in Scotland. Lydia was 68 and was finally given a court order for the exhumation of the grave of her son Gary, who died at the Royal Hospital for Sick Children in Edinburgh in 1975. When we're talking about exhumation, we're often talking about things that have been going on for a long, long time. I've dealt with so many individuals who've suffered for years for all sorts of reasons. And so I'm a little bit like Doctor Who. I go back in time and fix the situation. So the little boy died aged 7 days old. And Professor Dame Sue Black, whom you may well have seen on TV, forensic anthropologist who's very well known and a very brilliant person, she did the exhumation and she found a hat, a shawl, a cross and a name tag, but no body. And to add insult to injury, the name tag had spelled Gary's name incorrectly. Burial in the wrong grave. The memorial on the right, the curb set and headstone, was of a young man called Adam, who died far too young, and his family were obviously very distressed. And then in arranging the funeral, they thought ahead and they purchased in reserve half a dozen graves around his grave so that they would be able to be buried near their son. But then one snowy day, the grave diggers dug the grave next to their son to bury a random stranger by mistake. These things happened, and we exhumed that burial in order to give the family peace once more.
Peter.
Yeah.
My question was, going back to that young person that died, was it 5 days old, 7 days old?
Yeah.
What made her believe that her son was not in that grave?
I think I'm right in saying that she had held the coffin and it was too light. She always thought it felt too light, that it didn't have the weight of even a little baby in it. I think that was what was behind that.
And also that next one as well you've just shown, where the snow is on the ground, for example, and the grave digger got it wrong, which I get can happen. How did that work regarding telling the family where the most recent burial took place, sorry, we're gonna have to move your dad's grave because it shouldn't go on there?
Yeah, that's tough. I've actually, this particular local authority had a bit of a history of burying people in the wrong grave. And I actually acted on their behalf and went to a woman's home to actually tell her that we needed to exhume her husband. He'd been buried in the wrong grave. I've been put in all sorts of difficult situations.
Peter, I hope you're paid well, Peter.
Not enough, not enough. So, yeah, I've done some amazing things in my life. Started as a grave digger when I was 27. It seemed a good idea at the time. And I've done everything else involved in burial and cremation. I've cremated people, and I've managed crematoria and all that sort of thing, and cemeteries. And as a consultant, I've done a lot of work for all sorts of clients, local authorities, churches, government. Went out to Hong Kong to advise the government out there. And what gives me the motivation to carry on is the involvement in real living people. People are very skeptical and they say, "Oh, that's disgusting. You're working with dead people." Yes, I'm working with dead people, but it's all about the living. You have to show respect to the dead, and that respect should be shown at all times. And that's very much in the news because of the bad situation that's occurred in I think it's Hull, isn't it? Recently, with a funeral director apparently not looking after people, showing enough respect. But that respect remains, it's partly a cultural thing, but it's very much a personal thing, that cemeteries, churchyards, places, gardens of remembrance, people use the word sacred, whether they're religious or not. It's all about showing respect for people when they're alive and also when they're dead.
Peter, do you think since you started to where we're at now, have you seen a cultural shift in respect declining in churchyards and cemeteries?
It's a very difficult one because I've dealt with a lot of people who think it's a good idea to build a new cemetery, and one of the reasons they want to do it is to make a profit. And I try my best to explain that yes, it's very easy once you've overcome all the increasingly difficult hurdles set by the Environment Agency and other planning requirements. Once you've finally got your green field and you've got your planning approval, well, any fool can dig a hole, can't they? Anybody can bury a coffin, can't they? Well, the funeral director does that. We just dig the hole and we take the money. And it's great. Yes, people will even give you money to buy the grave next door or 6 others in reserve, money for nothing. So it seems like a brilliant money spinner. And I keep on trying again and again and again to explain to people, yes, that's true when you first open. But the reality is, the more people you bury, the more expensive it is to maintain the cemetery. People require the cemetery, the churchyard, to be maintained. Their loved one is buried there. They don't like the idea that they're in some unkempt, unloved place. And as time has passed in the last 41 years, it's nothing new. Oh, local government's under pressure, under financial pressure. They've always been under financial pressure, but it gets worse and worse and worse. They've got less and less money to carry on providing public services. So
what about private burial grounds? The increase in green burial sites from a commercial aspect?
Yes, it worries me. I'm aware of, I've done work for private companies that have opened new cemeteries. And what concerns me is ownership of those companies, those cemeteries changes. Every other year, it seems somebody else has now bought that cemetery. And I had a call from a guy saying, oh, let me just think a minute. I think he wanted me to do a report that proved that his cemetery, that had planning permission and I think had a few burials, that it was worth absolutely millions. And the reason he wanted this report was because he needed to sell it. And basically, I declined. And then within a year, I had a call from, no, within a month, I had a call from people whom he had approached to lend him money as a bridging loan. And they knew nothing about cemeteries. They were just people with money. And obviously, they need to understand the level of risk. I'm afraid to say I am not anti the private sector at all. I mean, I'm in the private sector. I worked in local government for quite a few years, but I've worked longer in the private sector. I'm not anti the private sector, but I'm afraid the lesson from history, right back to the early 19th century, when cemeteries actually first were begun by the private sector, and that wasn't all about profit. A lot of that was to do with nonconformist beliefs, wanting to be able to hold a funeral without a Church of England service. It was also in recognition of the overcrowded churchyards. It wasn't all about profit. But history has shown that some private cemeteries end up in a very poor state because ultimately the costs of maintenance grow with every passing year, with every burial that you do. And then once you've sold every virgin spot in the cemetery, you're reliant entirely upon income from reopened graves, which is significantly less. So you have declining income and increasing expenditure. Whether you're a local authority or a private sector person, that's what the nature of cemeteries is. That's the way they are. And people don't understand that. They never invest the money for the long term. So that's always been the case. Whether it's getting worse or not, it's hard to say, but it's certainly still true.
Thank you, Peter. That's really interesting. Yeah, but sorry to interrupt your flow.
Don't worry, we'll get back
Yeah.
to flow. The danger is that I can talk all night and the next day as well, but we'll carry on.
Well, my danger is I'm very inquisitive. I have like childlike interest in lots of things. So yeah, I'll leave you. I'll try not to disturb you too much more.
Well, if you don't ask questions, you don't find out the answers.
Exactly.
So personal reasons, there's bundles of personal, very personal reasons. I've dealt with hundreds of people who wanted to exhume their loved ones. And I've dealt with some, for want of a better word, some pretty wacky requests. But I don't bat an eyelid when somebody says, I want to exhume my mum, and I say, why? And they tell me the story. There's some incredible stories, and some of them, many of them, came to fruition, and I did exhume the whoever it was, but others were just not going to happen. I had a solicitor call me, a person, a woman, wanted to exhume one of the Cray twins for DNA sampling because she wanted to prove that she had had an illegitimate son. Something like that's never going to happen. Anyway, personal reasons. Moving home. I'm moving house, therefore I want to move my dad. Reuniting the deceased, and on the contrary, separating the deceased. That happens less, but that's very emotional. They were buried in a public grave. People don't understand that there are different kinds of graves. And for various reasons, people are buried in a grave in which other unrelated people are buried. And at a future point, maybe the day of the funeral or the day after or years later, the family decide that's not nice. We want our loved one in a private grave where it's just family. And then people want to exhume their loved ones because they don't like the location. There you go. So here we are, moving home.
Peter, sorry,
Yeah.
I'm doing it again. Surely the location not being where they wanted to be, or it's not being pretty enough, or we found a new area which is nicer, surely that's not a good enough reason.
There's a critically important distinction with places of burial. Whether or not, whoever owns it, has that particular part of the burial ground been consecrated by the Bishop of the Church of England? If it has, then it falls under the faculty jurisdiction of the Church of England. And I mean England, not Scotland, not Wales, Church of England. There are bishops of the Church of England in the House of Lords, and our good friend Henry VIII more or less enabled the creation of the Church of England. He didn't like the Pope, so all the rest of it. That's hundreds of years ago. So we've now got the situation where if you've got consecrated ground and somebody says, I want to exhume my loved one, they have to actually apply for a faculty from the Chancellor of the diocese. And there's a parallel universe of the consistory court. The Chancellor of the diocese is a QC. They're all, legal bods, but they take not just a legal, but a spiritual kind of view. And there are routinely people applying for faculties and they are declined. There are people routinely applying for faculties to permit exhumation and they're accepted. And being who I am, I save all of these individual decisions. And you're quite right. If somebody applies to exhume their mum, whoever, from consecrated ground because they don't like the view, then the Chancellor is not going to grant the faculty. However, if it's not consecrated ground, then one would apply to the Ministry of Justice, and they're not really bothered. They used to be, in the good old days when they were the Home Office many years ago, they were a bit fussy about your reasons. They didn't want people to have flippant reasons, but quite sensibly, they don't care anymore. They just want to make sure that they've got the right people, the permission of the right people to authorize the exhumation. So if somebody doesn't like the view and they apply to the Ministry of Justice, preferably building up a better story than I don't like the view that my mum's got, then yeah, it would go ahead. Now this...
Just to say, I know it's only my opinion, which doesn't mean a great amount, but I disagree with it. I just think, there should be a real solid reason, not just because I found a new place which is better. I don't think it's a good enough reason. It's my opinion. I'm being opinionated here, so feel free to shoot me down.
Well, I think there's a spectrum.
Surely that's not a good enough reason.
Yeah, there's a whole spectrum. One end of it is flippant. Oh, my mum wouldn't like the view from her grave, which is clearly flippant because mum can't see anymore. She's dead.
Yeah.
And then the other end of the spectrum, you've got nice, ordinary people who've buried their mum and they're bereaved, they're in grief, and they visit the grave, and some bugger next door is making a nuisance of themselves by trampling all over their mum's grave, by dumping rubbish or memorials on their mum's grave. They're spreading out from their loved one's grave onto their mum's grave, and it can become an absolute nightmare for people. Yeah. So you see what I mean? It's a whole spectrum, and in the case of consecrated ground, it's up to the Chancellor to make the decision. It's a little bit like King Solomon, the story in the Bible where two women go to King Solomon and they're arguing about the baby, whose is it, and all the rest of it. And he shows his wisdom, his famous wisdom, by coming up with an answer. We can't come up with an answer for all of these difficult situations that lead to people wanting an exhumation. And it's very difficult to set criteria. That's my Siberian Husky talking to me. He may interrupt us. It's very difficult for anybody apart from the Chancellor, because he has the legal position, to lay down the law to say, well, no, that's not a good enough reason.
My last little point then on this area, and I promise you I'll move on. I asked a question about respect. Is it declining in churchyards and cemeteries? And if the Chancellor is now allowing more to go through because someone is having a bad day and they want their mum now moved, if the discipline is now being watered down, then I think how I feel is like the respect is declining, because actually it shouldn't be that easy to move mum and dad from the grave. That's only my opinion. I'll pipe down now, Peter. I'll pipe down now.
I don't think that there's a Chancellor for every diocese of the Church of England, and they are part of their own little gang, the Ecclesiastical Judges Association. I don't think that they're weakening. They issue their long judgments about whether or not they're going to grant a faculty, referring to previous cases and all the rest of it. And they do decline an awful lot of applications. Okay. So I don't think there's an erosion as far as consecrated ground is concerned. But then, if you like, the reasons may be increasingly flippant for non-consecrated ground and Ministry of Justice exhumation licenses. This photograph here is somebody's back garden, and Mum said, when I die I want to be buried in the back garden, so the kids buried her in the back garden. But for all sorts of unpleasant family reasons, her husband, from whom she was trying to get a divorce at the time of her death, was still her next of kin. And he said, no, I'm having that house and get her out of there. So we did. And then this is another back garden. Again, it was a sad story of divorce leading to the need to remove somebody from the back garden. Both situations, the property was going to be sold, and the potential mortgage lender said, lovely, I'll lend you the money to buy that house, but not if that person's still buried in there, because potentially that gives third parties rights of access over this land, which we've lent the money on. So dig them up.
I like how the washing line is next to the grave.
Yeah, well, we could use that as a tent to screen it from the public gaze. But as you can see, hang on a minute, I'm getting claws and bites. Let me open the. What are you going to do, Max? Right. A lot of the cases that you as funeral directors deal with are sad. Death is, generally speaking, sad, and people are distressed when their loved one dies. This is natural, regardless of ethnicity, religious belief, culture, time. People are upset when somebody dies. And I've dealt with some incredibly sad stories. And Kim was a very sad story. And I think all is forgotten is her mother saying, it's all over now, your sad life is over. Anyway, she buried Kim in a cemetery where they lived. Then she and her husband decided that they would move across the country to support a relative who was not very well at all. They lived there for a short time supporting that person who died. Then they retired somewhere else. Then her husband died. She was left alone, and she thought, oh, and she kept thinking about Kim. And she got in touch with me, and I exhumed Kim and personally drove her in the back of my vehicle and sat with her on the ferry over to the Isle of Wight and delivered her to the funeral director. So that was moving for personal reasons. I didn't like the location. In her case, I think there were very strong reasons why she would want that. And similarly with this one, I featured in a number of TV documentaries, I think 4 in total. And in 2009, we did the Exhumer, which was basically all about me and what I do in terms of exhumation. And in that program, we have Phil Walker, who was a young child. He and his brother lost their mum and their dad, and it was incredibly sad. And Granny never did like her daughter-in-law, Rose. She was foreign, as you can see from this name. She was Belgian, and also she was Catholic. And she died first, and her husband, James, buried her in a grave for 2, thinking, when I die, I'll be buried with my wife. He carried on for 3 years and just couldn't go on and killed himself. And his mother, instead of burying him with his wife, buried him in another grave hundreds of yards away. It was in the same cemetery, but it was hundreds of yards away. And so this little, can you imagine, the little kid of, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old, he's lost his mum and his dad. And when he goes to visit the graves with his granny, she takes him to one grave to dad, and then hundreds of yards away his mum, and it traumatized him. And he spent many years trying to deal with all of that. And then he saw my first documentary on Channel 4 in 2001 and thought, oh, that guy could help me. And he got in touch with me. And it literally took 10 years. He was just so traumatized by it all. And it was challenging because Rose was buried in, one of them was buried in consecrated ground, and I needed a faculty. And I actually met the Chancellor of the Diocese down in the cemetery with Phil, which is extremely unusual. And we finally exhumed them. And I said to Phil, look, we've known each other a long time now. We finally reached this situation. Are you going to entrust your mum and dad to a stranger, a funeral director? you run a commercial removals company, you've got vehicles, why don't you transport your mum and dad to Belgium? Because he was taking them back to where mum was born. Her mum's dad was the leader of the Belgian resistance. James, Phil's dad, was working for the British services, shall we say. He was parachuted behind enemy lines to work with the Belgian resistance. And so Phil wanted to bury them together finally, not in the cemetery in London, but in the village where they got married in Belgium. So Phil did all of that. He kitted out his van, lined it with purple, and he took his mum and dad over to Belgium, and they had a funeral service. I could go on all night about that one. It's
Peter,
a very, very moving
you,
story.
Peter, for you personally, be involved in that from
Yeah.
a level of like fulfillment. How did that feel for you when that's complete?
Oh, it's very powerful. You work with somebody for 10 years on and off. I mean, it started off with the fact that he and his brother, and I think partly because of their childhood situation, they'd parted company. They were separated. He'd not seen his brother or heard of him for 21 years. And so I tracked his brother down. And his brother, I advertised, and his brother phoned me. And Maura was very cross and said, "There's no way I'm going to give my consent." And then he wrote to me and he said, "I rang you up and you accepted that I was his brother and I could have been anybody." And he couldn't have been. He sounded just like Phil. And it was years, another few years passed before Phil's son made contact with let me work it out, his cousin. And through that, he said, "Your dad, he really ought to talk to my dad. He really wants to move, grandmum and granddad." Oh, and finally it all happened. When it was all done and dusted, Phil, by the way, in his van arrived. He went on the ferry straight to Belgium rather than through France, because France was going to charge ridiculous amounts of money to allow him passage through to Belgium. And the border guard was being a bit stuffy. So Phil pulled out his wad of paperwork that I'd sent him. So he had his faculty and he had his Ministry of Justice license, all with their official stamps on. And he blagged it. He said, "Look, I'm on government business. Look at these forms." And so the border guard flipped and he had a police escort all the way from the border to the village. I mean, the amazing things about the story go on and on and on. So I was happy as Larry that, everything was cool. And then Phil rang me a couple of weeks later and he was just trying to express how he felt, which you can imagine was very difficult. And he said, "There's one thing I regret." And I thought, "Oh no, after 10 years, something you regret." And he said, "Yeah, that I didn't invite you to the funeral."
Oh, yeah.
But he took photographs and he sent them to me. And he was not really expecting a funeral, but the vicar priest over there did a full whammy in the church, and he did it in English and in whichever language, Flemish or French, I'm not sure. He really did feel proud. So it's extremely fulfilling to help somebody who's been in distress for 50 years. And he's not the only one that I've
Probably
done.
like subconsciously as well. It probably allows them to move forward their lives in a better way. It's kind of like
Absolutely
the ultimate thorn in your side. So like
Yeah.
you're the person taking that thorn out almost. So
Yeah. We think that, death is the end. When it happens, your whole world stops and you can't believe that the person's died, even though you knew they had bowel cancer, that they were going to die soon. And it's the human condition. And you're deeply upset. We know this. And we know grief never dies. You get over it. Time heals. But my mother died when I was 23, and I'm 69 now. Do I ever think about my mother? Of course I do. Do I miss my mother? Of course I do. if she were, and my father died, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. It may sound harsh, but I can't tell you the date. Um, and I still catch myself sort of turning to speak to them. Um, and I know that's the universal situation. It's death is really hard to deal with. And so exhumation is in many cases, it's a window into individual grief, individual circumstances. I've worked with hundreds of people, families, who've all had a completely different story, and I fixed it. I made I made it right. I couldn't bring the person back to life, but I could move them or do whatever it is that they wanted me to do and give them peace. It's a very
Because I think it is it's incredible what you do. My other question was regarding certain people. You know, I want to move mom or dad to the other part of the cemetery because it's prettier over there. Have you carried it out ever? And they were expecting to be feeling a lot better afterwards, but actually they're just still in pain. They're just still grieving. Therefore, what you've done actually hasn't resolved their issue because at the end of the day, they want their mom or dad back, and you can't do that. Have you seen that before or not really?
I've not. I might remember after we finished this evening, but I can't think of anybody. I mean, Phil. Uh, I rang Phil 10 years after I'd done the exhumation to see how he was doing.
Yeah.
And he said, "Yes, I often think of you. I keep meaning to call you. There's a contact." Um, and I did have an Italian gentleman who phoned me, and he could hardly speak English, and he phoned me some time after I'd helped him with his daughter, a very tragic story. But very often I don't hear
Yeah.
afterwards,
Okay.
and I don't impose myself on people, so I don't know the answer to your question. I don't
Okay.
know.
Thanks, Peter.
So we, as I say, if I talked now about all these different families, we'd be here till the dawn or later. So I've just done a selection. This is separating the deceased. What do we have here? We have an empty grave. And this was a sad situation that a guy died, and naturally his wife and two sons were upset about it all. And they buried dad in the family grave in a churchyard where grandmum and granddad were buried. It seemed the right thing to do at the time. And they got on with their grieving. But it wasn't that long afterwards that the wife found out her husband had been cheating on her with the same woman. He didn't have flings. He had a lifetime relationship with another woman for their entire marriage. And so she said to me, "Get that bastard out of my grave." Yes, she did, Max. "Get that bastard out of my grave." And that needed a faculty and all the rest of it. And so then I had it all set up because there's all these different people involved in the exhumation. Somebody to remove the memorial and dig the grave. Then my team turn up, and if I'm coming, I'm going to turn up. The environmental health officer's got to turn up. You've got to line up the coffin, line up, well, where is the person going? So I did all of that, phoned her up and said, "Hey, right, we're good to go. We're going to do this on Wednesday." And he said, "Oh, no, can you put that off?" I said, "What?" She said, "I'm going to France on a holiday for a fortnight. Can you do it when I get back?" And I said, "No." I said, "Look, why? Why does it matter?" She said, "Oh, I want to be there. I want to make sure you get him out of that grave." And I said, "Listen, I'll take a photograph. I'll take more than one to show you that he's gone. That bastard is gone." And so this is the photograph that I sent her. We did the exhumation on the day I'd arranged and got him out. So that's separating the deceased. Common public grave, common grave. This isn't a very salubrious looking area. This is an area of unpurchased grave. It's full of graves with multiple burials of unrelated people. And again, it's another amazing story of a brother and sister. They were young, same as Phil and his brother. They would have been similar sort of age, 7 and 8. Their dad was blind, and we're a little bit more enlightened about disability, or I hope so these days, and we have the Equality Act and all the rest of it. But in the good old days, if you were disabled, you were lucky to have work, and very often the best you could get was something like a routine sort of task. So their dad made baskets, which is actually a beautiful thing to do. To make willow baskets is an amazing gift. Anyway, he made willow baskets, and his wife got sick and died. And she was obviously a young woman, and they didn't have a lot of money because he was just making baskets. So she was buried in a common grave. But because this was, whatever, 60 years ago now, 70 years ago now, the children were not allowed to attend the funeral. Now, their dad must have been an amazing guy because he was blind, but a woman married him and had his children and loved him. Then his wife died, so he's now a bloke with 2 kids in tow. And you'd think, well, things are pretty grim here. He met another woman who loved him and married him. And contrary to the ugly stepmother, the wicked stepmother scenario, the girl and the boy loved their stepmom, and they lived happily for whatever, 50 years. I think it was 50 years. Then she died, and Dad decided that she would be cremated. Maybe that's what she wanted. So son and daughter, brother and sister, now obviously mature adults, they would visit the crematorium garden of remembrance and put flowers on their stepmother's plot at Christmas and on her birthday. There was no ill feeling. But they got to thinking, well, I wonder what happened to our real mum. And so they then did some research and found that she'd been buried in this unpurchased grave. Dad was now beginning to get the early signs of dementia. I'm going to open that door. Excuse me. You go out, Max. Go on. Not only had Mum been buried in an unpurchased grave with unrelated people, she had an unrelated man on top. And brother and sister, all credit to them, they traced the relatives of this guy buried on top of their mum and got in writing his consent to shift his relatives so that they could have their mum out. And my recollection is I needed a faculty. Yes, I did. I needed a faculty for that. When the chancellors are considering faculty applications for exhumations, there are a number of factors that they look at. And one of them is time since burial. The longer since the person was buried, the less likely you're going to get the faculty. And I've had 100% success rate with getting faculties, and most of mine have been quite long. So Phil and this one were 50 years, and I still got the faculty because the grounds of their request were very powerful. So what we were going to do is move Dad to a new grave in a cemetery. Let me think, the same one as this? I think it was a different one, actually. And I had it all set up, and the same thing happened. I said, look, it's all set up. It's going to happen on this day. And the brother and sister said, oh, our vicar can't come on that day. And I said, oh dear. I tell you what, can I be the vicar? Can I do the funeral service? And they said, yeah, you do it. And that's what we did. So we exhumed the top person, put them to one side, privately and decently, had a separate tent for them. We got Mum out, put her in the new coffin, drove her round, had her on the put logs, ready to be lowered into the grave. And for a change, I was dressed smartly in my suit and waiting. And then I saw all these people arriving, and they were all dressed up. And I thought, that's funny. They look like they're all dressed up for a funeral. And I realized it was my client and the family and their friends, and they had all dressed up. This was the funeral they'd never had 50 years ago. Can you imagine that? It's your mum, and she died 50 years ago, and you didn't know where she was. You'd never attended the funeral. So today, there you are. There's a coffin with your mum's name on, and you know Mum's in there because Peter's telling you Mum's in there. And so I did a short service and we buried Mum.
Can I just say, Peter, isn't it interesting that that's 50 years later, you're providing closure and healing for that family?
Yeah,
And right at the start, you discuss about all the stuff going on in Hull, how there hasn't been any care. And
yeah.
it goes to show the impact that, like, these, 50 years on, what the impact there is. So, again, like 4 weeks after the funeral, having the wrong ashes back and
Yeah.
deliberately, you know, obviously it's criminal investigation. We don't know what's gone on exactly, but things have been done with intent. And it goes to show 50 years later the impact it has. So
They'll,
this is the reason why it's so powerful
yeah,
to show care, isn't it?
it is that the impact on those people will not go away. And once you've got an element of doubt, and I haven't got a slide for it, but I had a funeral director had a nightmare that a client said, hang on a minute, you've written to me saying, what do I want to do with my mum's ashes? But you buried my mum's ashes, or you said you did. I attended in that burial ground in the village. So what's going on? Have we buried my mum or not? And there's only one way to find out, isn't there? You've got to dig up the ashes, and she's got to see. And so I personally dug up the ashes. And of course, the nameplate on the casket said her mum's name. Excuse, I'm very sorry. I've got to let my husky back in now. Oh, dear. Come on, Max. Just settle down. So I had with me, of course, my trusty impact driver, and I flipped the casket over and opened the casket, and sure enough, inside were the ashes. Great. And in the bag with the ashes was the identity label from the crematorium, and it was her mum. Marvelous. That was a win. And that underlines this element of care. A lot of people think that administration's boring, paperwork and all the rest of it. You can't have somebody working in a funeral director sending out a letter to a client asking for instructions on what to do with the body or the ashes when you've already done something with the body or the ashes. You've got to show that care in all the details of the administration. What else? Here's another great story. Top centre, Giuseppina and Raffaele, obviously Italians. Little Giuseppina came home from school one day. She was about 12, I think, and said, Mum, I don't feel very well. I've got a headache. And Mum said, oh, don't worry, darling. Well, why don't you lie down? So she lay down on the settee and died. You know, that shouldn't happen. A little 12-year-old shouldn't lie down and die. Anyway, they were Italians. They didn't bury in the ground. They're part of Italy. They buried above ground in chambers, but there weren't any in Croydon. So she was buried in a heavy clay soil in Mitcham Road Cemetery in Croydon. And then years later, Dad never got over it. I mean, like you would, your daughter dying like that. He died. And so Mum buried him with the daughter. But she, not only did she have the grief of losing a daughter so tragically and now losing her husband and being alone, not only that, but it was against her culture that they should be in soggy ground. So Dignity, this is Streatham, South London Cemetery and Crematorium. They created a new community mausoleum. So they're separate chambers, but you know, there's lots of different people, as you can see. So they put up the money and bought one of these things. They're not cheap. And I've got a feeling I had to get a faculty. And I remember I was providing a new casket. And so the family wanted to see it. I said, okay. So I put the casket with help in the back of my estate car, and I drove around to their house somewhere in South London, parked outside, knocked on the door. They all trooped out of the house. We went, I don't know what the neighbours thought. This is the point of my story. What would you think if you were a neighbour and you see your neighbours trotting out, crossing the road and going over, and some guy with an estate car lifts it up so that they can look in and see a casket? And they said, lovely, we like that, we'll have that one. And we did the exhumation, and the very often, oh, this is an important point. Sometimes the environmental health officer or somebody will say to me, the family want to attend the exhumation, what shall I do? And my answer is, what is the ethnicity of the family? Are they Italian? Yes. Well, that's all right then. What? I said, that's all right. Italians are used to exhumation as a concept, and also from a practical point of view. If they're white British, no, pretty much under no circumstances, do not let them attend an exhumation. We Brits can't cope with stuff like that. So
Isn't that
when we
isn't that like an assumption though? Isn't that assuming? Doesn't that reinforce why we are so bad in society? Because
no,
white Brits, leave them alone. They're too weak. They can't handle that.
it's because I deal with white Brits and I see the problems it creates, and I deal with Italians, Greeks. We did an exhumation once, and it was a metal casket, and the family were there. There were three well-built ladies dressed very smartly, white stiletto shoes, white handbags, and they were dressed in their finery. They were looking fabulous, and there was a young man with them. And I thought, oh yeah, this is cool, because this is a really grotty, muddy, horrible hole that we're digging in. And when we got down to the casket, I could see straight away what had happened. When they backfilled the grave, they had shown, we're back to this thing, they had shown a lack of care and a lack of respect. And they had compacted the soil, the clay, with the digger bucket, ramming it down. So they'd completely buckled in the lid of this metal casket. And so I specially arranged to have the Allen key or whatever it was, so I could open the casket to get the guy out of it, to put him into his new coffin. And that was totally useless. So we literally had to use a pickaxe to lever this twisted and bent lid off a casket in order to get the guy. This is while the family watched. And once we'd got him out of the grave and we had him on the side, the family were on the other side of the excavated spoil. So they all climbed over well, the boy wasn't wearing stilettos, but the ladies in their white stilettos clambered over this heap of wet clay in order to see dad and husband. So this was not my dream exhumation. Things like that shouldn't really happen. Anyway, we did it and off we went. A year later, I picked up the phone and a guy said, I don't know if you remember me. And immediately I recognized his voice. I said, I think I do know you. And he said, yeah, I'm John. You exhumed my dad, Fred, at so and so. I said, yeah, I thought it was you. And he said, oh, I'm just ringing to see if you've got any jobs going. I'd like to work with you. And you think, wow.
Yeah.
So he's seen his dad's
Impact,
exhumation under
impact,
extremely difficult
impact made.
circumstances. Yeah.
Yeah, impact's been made, isn't it? So
So they were Samoan. I knew that they weren't Italian or Greek. I knew that they were not white British. White British people would not have clambered over the clay with their stilettos on, would not have phoned me a year later saying, hey, have you got a job? White Brits don't behave like that. I had a Greek gentleman whose son was murdered. We exhumed his son, and he wanted to see his son. And his son was not in a condition which should be viewed, even by a Greek person. He was pretty decomposed. However, parts of him were not decomposed. And so I said on the day, I said, okay, this is the deal. What we're going to do is we're going to lead you into the tent. We want you to keep your eyes closed, because it's distressing what you would see. I want you to keep your eyes closed, and we will let you touch your son. And so we put his hand on his son's hand. And then he walked out of the tent and we got on with the job. And he wrote to me and said, thank you so much. That was a very cathartic experience. And again, it's just I've had an awful lot of experience, and I really don't think white British people would be doing things like that and then
Yeah,
writing a letter saying thank you afterwards.
yeah, yeah. No, it's just yeah. I say it sort of cynically, and
Yeah,
it's quite
but
sad, really. We can't be more like that.
yeah, I think so. I think their attitude is far healthier.
Yeah, oh yeah, I totally agree.
So this is moving home big style. I did this job for the Brazilian embassy. They had Hipólito da Costa, except his name was longer than that, who had died in 1849 or something like that in Britain. Now, he was living in exile because Brazil wasn't a state at the time, but whoever was running Brazil, he wasn't popular with them because he was expressing liberal views and thoughts and all the rest of it. So he was, if you like, a political refugee. And living in England, of course, he got sick and died of a cold or something like that. And it was thought that he might be buried in the floor, beneath the floor of a Grade One listed church by the Thames. So we had archaeologists with us, and I actually invited Brian Patterson from the then Home Office. He's long retired now. I said, "Well, you never actually go to exhumations, do you, Brian? Why don't you come to one and see what's what?" And I'd had a meeting with the Brazilian ambassador in the embassy in London, and so I listened to all the guff, and I could see there was some confusion, and I just cut through it, and I said, "Look, this is what we have to do. Oh, and by the way, what you're doing with Hipólito? Oh, well, we're going to put him in a chamber in Brasilia. It's part of our 200-year anniversary to celebrate the founding of Brazil." I said, "Okay, how big's this chamber?" And they gesticulated. So, in other words, it was only a small chamber. And I said, "Look, we might have a problem here, because if this guy was buried in a lead-lined coffin, and if the lead is preserved, then he is going to be in a fairly good state of preservation. And we're not going to be able to ship him out to South America and stick him in a little chamber. So you have to be aware that that might happen." Anyway, as I left the room, the ambassador shook my hand and said, "You know what?" He said words to the effect of, "You're the first person that's talked any sense. I'm really pleased. Thank you very much. Go ahead and do it." So here we are doing it. So we had to move the Grade One listed quarry tiles, and we were digging and we couldn't find anything. And then finally we hit what turned out to be the brick vaulted roof of the chamber. And we had a little guy working with us who went down. And lo and behold, we have a very well preserved looking lead coffin. Now, what people don't get, even if they see a picture of a lead coffin, visualize a jam sandwich. And then I'm telling you, the lead is the jam. So the body is put in a wooden coffin, which is then wrapped in lead, which is then lowered into a wooden coffin. So you get what I mean? The lead is a middle layer. So the outer layer has rotted off. You can see bits of it lying on the top. And so I was saying, "Oh dear, this isn't looking promising. How are we going to fit him in a little hole in Brasilia?" Anyway, here's his Hipólito Joseph da Costa Pereira, commander of the something or other Order of the Crozier, died 11th of September 1823, age 46. That's marvelous. And it turned out that his coffin, because the Thames rose and fell, the water level rose and fell, his coffin was bashing around against the walls, and it had holes in it. And once you let the air in, then decomposition can occur. So here we are with the archaeologists sorting out which is Hipólito and which is the remains of his inside coffin. And then off he went to Brasilia. There you go. Now, we've talked about single exhumations. Now we're talking about multiple exhumations. There's all sorts of reasons why you might dig up more than one person at once. And in these cases, I'm not talking about somebody comes to me and says, "Oh, I've got 6 relatives buried in a grave in somewhere, can you move them?" That's a multiple exhumation, but not like this. Multiple exhumations are normally nothing to do with the family. And depending on how old the burials are, You may or may not need or be legally required to advertise your intentions to carry these out. So you might want to extend a church. There might be structural issues with a church. You might want to completely redevelop an old burial ground for some other purpose. And then we've got the idea of reusing old graves because we're running out of burial space. So let's talk about those. So on the right, you can see a lovely old flint church. And then the red door thing is an ugly 1970s room built on. And I don't think at the time of building it, they bothered about worrying about would anybody be buried there. However, more recently, we wanted to extend the church. So you can see there's gravestones, there were burials, and they had ground penetrating radar surveys and stuff like that. And I looked at it all and I said, I don't believe that. And when we actually did clear the area of burials, the ground penetrating radar was completely inaccurate. So there's the site after we had removed all the people and we reburied them in the local cemetery. And then they subsequently extended the church. Structural issues. Here's the wall. The picture doesn't adequately show how wobbly that wall was, but it does show that it was a big wall. Now, bearing in mind, this is in the middle of Kirkcaldy in Scotland, and mums and children and buggies would be walking up and down that pavement every day, the council decided that they ought to do something about this highly dangerous wall. So we needed to move people behind that wall at a much higher level, it has to be said, so that they could repair the wall. Now, Scottish churchyards seem to have a problem with their boundary walls. Here's another one in a village where there's big cracks in the wall, so they propped it up rather seriously while they considered what to do. And here are the burials on the top of that wall, which we needed to move so that they could take the wall down and rebuild it, and then we put the bodies back again. This is yet another churchyard in Scotland. Did this more recently. And all of these graves on the right-hand side there, the headstones, we had to move those because that whole wall was going to fall down into the street. The rather rugged-looking memorial in the foreground, the family refused to give permission. So we sort of had to tiptoe around them. And here we are, tiptoeing around them. You can see their memorial, all the others have gone. But it reached the stage where, interestingly, north of the border, the law is different. And the sheriff, the equivalent of the coroner, he wouldn't appreciate me saying that, but the sheriff said, right, dig them up. He overruled the family's objections because we couldn't actually make the new wall and make it safe. Not exhuming those bodies prevented us from ensuring public safety, and he overruled, which was the right thing to do, quite frankly. So it all got muddy. I'm not showing you all the pictures because they're very muddy. And here we are getting closer and closer to this particular grave. And there we are afterwards. Magic. I've waved my magic wand. We've done the job. The grass is growing. All the memorials are back in place, including the family who didn't want it. The railings are back in place. But you can see that the railings were taken down. In fact, they're completely new railings. Those are the stone copings, and you can see where the railings have been cut off. And you can see the new concrete wall. So they built a new, or they used the old stones to put a new wall there, which looks fabulous. But it's got the concrete wall supporting, with concrete wall with big feet. So there's a reason why you would dig up a whole load of people, including overruling the wishes of a family, to ensure that people could walk up and down and drive up and down that road without getting killed. What's this? Oh, this is still going on. This is a situation that is the tip of the iceberg. You may or may not be familiar that normally in a cemetery you dig a hole and it's mud or rock or sand or whatever, and you bury people in that. Because of concerns about the environmental impact of the burial of the dead, in other words, pollution of groundwaters, it's increasingly difficult to get permission for a cemetery. And this local authority, they'd owned this land for donkey's years, and you can see the big trees in the distance. This is a cemetery extension, but they had to apply for planning permission, and the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency objected and said, no way, Jose, you're going to pollute the planet. The only way we'll let you bury people there is if you bury them in concrete chambers. So they got in touch with the concrete chamber manufacturers, and who said, oh yeah, we've installed thousands of these all over the UK. They will solve your problems. And so they installed a whole bundle of them there, and they started burying people in them in 2018. And it got to 2020-ish, 21, and one retired gentleman whose wife was buried began to get a bit concerned, shall we say. He could hear water dripping, and then he brought a bucket of water and poured it on top of the gravel on his wife's grave, and he could hear the water dripping into the chamber. Now, the reason that the water was dripping into the chamber is because the 8 separate concrete slats that go over the top of the chamber, which you're going to see in a photograph soon, possibly the next one, yes, they're not sealed. It's a chamber that's deep enough for 2 burials. You bury the person in the bottom chamber, and there are 8 slats that rest on a ledge in the middle of the concrete chamber. You seal those, and then you just put these other ones loose on top. So when it rains, the theory is the top chamber may become full of water, but the bottom chamber stays dry, and then you pump out the top chamber, put the second burial in, seal those slats, and everything in the garden is rosy. And it turned out to be a really bad idea. And I think there are thousands of these. I know there are thousands of these installed in the UK, and I bet every single one of them's full of water, because it's virtually impossible to stop the rain getting in if you've got something like that, unless you have a solid lid and divert the water away. And the tops of these chambers were at ground level. You can see they're butting up against each other. It's just a nightmare. So we've had to exhume. I've talked about, and I felt the emotion just talking about it and thinking about all these people that I've worked with over the years. It's a very emotional business when you want to exhume your loved one, but to get a letter from the council saying, hey, we're going to exhume your mum because she's probably in a flooded chamber, that really has caused lasting damage. So we started
as well. There's the colossal errors here. Firstly, the council saying you got to have these chambers because of the environment, which I think is,
it's not the council's fault. It's the Environment Agency's fault for saying.
Is that correct though? Are they correct in saying that?
They have the power to.
But are they correct? Is it actually a problem having more people in the cemetery? Is it going to cause a problem for the environment? And now what they've
But then
what they've done now, surely what you're showing me here is more of a risk hazard to health.
Yes, it is. It's because everyone assumed that the concrete burial chambers would be waterproof.
Oh, of course. But now it's a colossal issue now.
Yeah, and it's going to go to court. Families are suing the council for distress and all the rest of it. So other cemeteries, local authorities and private cemeteries with these chambers, they are either unaware of the situation, even though it's been on the BBC, or they might be aware, but they don't want to look in their own back garden because it opens a can of worms. And it is a moral dilemma. I'll just raise the dilemma, but we'll move on from it. You can think about it. What if you were responsible for a cemetery somewhere, and you've heard me tell you this story, and you now think Peter, who is the expert, is telling me that in all likelihood, my chambers are full of water. What am I going to do about it? If I start investigating and find out that they are full of water, this is going to cost, this cost them millions. It's going to cost you a lot of money to sort out the problem. Worse still, what the eye don't see, the heart don't grieve over. If the families don't know that their loved ones are submerged in water, they're not going to be upset. If you sow the seed of doubt, oh, can I have your permission to open the chamber to check? You've now sown the seed of doubt and you're causing them upset. And then you do check and you say, oh, we've checked and they are full of water. You're now causing that family huge distress. So there is a great temptation to not ask questions and look. Anyway, that is with the slats
Oh
removed.
my
Can you
lord.
see the right
Wow.
hand side is daylight shining on the water, and then
Wow.
this is the shadow, and those are actually tree roots, the furry thing. Trees water, like water, so their roots are searching out the water.
How
So
deep is
that's
that, Peter? How deep is that?
that top chamber is it's less than 3 feet deep. It's just deep enough for a coffin to go in. So down below, there's not a coffin in the top chamber, but there is in the bottom chamber. So we have to drain out the water, and this is what we see. So you've got the 8 slats resting on the ledge either side, and they've been sealed with sealant as recommended by the supplier. And the sealant does not keep out the rain. If you imagine that you notice one day there's a tile missing on your roof, and you ask the builder about it, and the builder says, oh, don't worry about that. Yeah, the water will get in, but it'll only get into your roof space because I've sealed the roof space with sealant, so it won't get in your bedroom. That's not a lot of comfort.
No.
So the theory is that that sealant keeps the bottom chamber dry. But the reality is, particularly if you're applying sealant in filthy cold weather to cold concrete, and it's just an impractical. You can't expect anybody to achieve a perfect seal with that technology. What you need is a solid roof on top of each chamber, which is what we're doing. We are not only undertaking the exhumations, not only recoffining the recently deceased who are decomposed, and putting them in shiny new solid oak coffins, we're also cutting the edge of the chamber. You can see on the left of the screen, you see those slats and you see there's a black line, a shadow. That's a small gap. It's a very small gap. So we're having to widen the gap to enable us to fit, when we put it all back together again, to fit aluminium lids on to divert the rain. So I'm confident that we've solved the problem,
Two,
but at a
two, two
huge cost.
questions, Peter. Two questions. So that there's a coffin there submerged in water. That's my question. Are the coffins in water?
Yep, everyone.
My second question is, who's paying for this, if you're allowed to say?
The council, and it's costing millions. The total costs, I'm talking about officer time, stamps on letters, envelopes, paper,
Coffins, new coffins. Yeah.
new coffins, my fees, building contractors' fees, and all the rest of it.
Compensation yet? Is that compensation in there yet for the families?
No, no, and the compensation issue is going to be settled in court, no doubt. But you can see the sealant, so that's gripping, physically challenging to do the work. And you can see the sealant on the slats there. Here you can see a top chamber. There was a second burial, so the coffin is actually floating. And what amazed me, I was obviously planning this for quite a long time, lying in bed awake at night thinking how I was going to deal with the situation. And I fully expected the coffins to have just disintegrated. But man-made board or solid wood, incredibly, every single coffin we've got up whole.
Wow.
So there is the lower coffin.
Was there water? I'm guessing there's water in the coffins, though.
Yeah. Coffins.
And the health hazards of the water as well must be really dangerous as well.
Yeah, we had IBCs, those white plastic things, 1,000 litres on pallets. We were filling, well, each chamber, I'm just trying to remember. I think there's 300 litres in the top chamber and 300 litres in the bottom chamber of polluted water. And what can I say? Your olfactory senses were assailed by this water. But there you go. There's the evidence. That's how we did it. And
Peter, as well, the company that laid the concrete slabs, aren't they liable for this?
that's for the lawyers to decide. I couldn't possibly comment on that.
Sorry, I'm not trying to down a rabbit hole. I'm just so inquisitive by it all. That's nice and clean, isn't it? That's good.
So this is a useful photograph. Can you see on the left, we've got slats on the chamber next door, and we've actually trimmed those slats so they're shorter. So we've now created a gap. We've cut away the concrete between, part of the concrete wall of two chambers either side to create a gap. Now, if you look over on the right, you can see an aluminium lid with sides, and on top of that is a glass reinforced. Not now, Max. You be quiet. We put a glass reinforced plastic sheet. It's the sort of thing you see on railway station steps. So it's it's anti-slip treated.
Yeah.
And we're putting the gravel back on top of that. But the black sheet is to protect the aluminium from people walking with, the pebbles, because they're sharp. So then we do the reburials, and then we're using a screed. Instead of sealant, we're using a screed, even though we don't think water's going to get in because we're putting the lids, we're screeding. So it's a long job. So you can see the finished article. So this is not Scotland. This is a church near the British Museum where we shifted. Can you see them? There are 600 lead coffins, or it might have been 700, can't remember. 700 lead coffins there. Can you see them? No, it's because they're behind the walls to the right and the left. All right. So this is a church crypt, and the crypt of a church is obviously the same size as the floor of the church because it's underneath the church, and there's different types. You have to have support for the building above and the floor of the church, one form or another. So you can see the curved roof, which is a strong support. And the parochial church council were spending a lot of money conserving and renovating this church. And I think it had been established that there was a damp problem in the crypt. And so they had archaeologists in and did reports and all the rest of it. And then we came in to clear all these coffins. And there they are. So we're now inside one of the side chambers, and some coffins were placed on metal racks, which is what you're looking at. And can you see there are the feet ends of two coffins clearly visible on the right half of the photograph. So they had not only put the coffins there, they backfilled with sand and then a layer of charcoal. And my recollection is that they thought this had been done not after each burial. This had been done 100 years after the burials, because people recognized there was a bit of a smell and there was also a damp problem. So not only did we shift 700 coffins and rebury them, we had to shift tons of soil, and it all had to go up a single staircase, stone staircase, that we had not to damage because it was all grade 1 listed. And the mind boggles. The environmental health officer said, there's no way you're going to do this. Because once we started, we then established that there weren't 100 as originally thought, that there were 700. So it was going to cost them more money and all the rest of it. And they were buying new graves for these guys to be reburied in. So that was costing a lot of money. Do you know what? We did the whole job in 7 weeks. Unbelievable.
Wow.
Unbelievable. Wow. Unbelievable. So there's 3 coffins on the right with their feet ends showing. There's 3 coffins in the center, sideways on. They're not on racking. And there's all the rubble we had to clear as well. And this is all under coming out of our door, up the steps and through the door, we would be in view of tall, posh buildings opposite residential properties that all had to be dealt with. Here's another job. This is in East London. This is Poplar. And this is a church, I think it's All Saints Poplar, that white church behind on the left. And that is actually across the road. The church and its churchyard are across a side road. This was the churchyard extension, and that memorial, granite memorial, commemorates, it doesn't give the numbers, but it commemorates people buried there. And in fact, I got onto this job because the archaeology consultant rang me up and described the situation. And he said, the Church of England have even sworn an affidavit that there's nobody buried there. And I said, I don't believe it. And I was right. There were originally 10,000 people buried there. We exhumed 1,000 so that they could build a new. It had, on the right is the remains of a medical centre built on the site in the 1970s, and it was built on a huge concrete grid foundation buried, I think, 3 meters in the ground. And that's why they said, oh no, there's no bodies there. They were all below that level. And so
you don't think they were aware and just thought it will cost us millions to move it? Not millions, but a lot of money to move it.
I can't possibly comment. So on the right of that photograph is a tower block. That is the other side of the A13 commercial road. The shiny building there is a brand new medical centre, which is serving the population of Poplar. And the memorial, there it is, still in place. So there you go. And we weren't there that long either, thinking about it. This is a job that we spent 18 months doing. This is St Pancras Station, St Pancras International. So they extended St Pancras to improve services to the Midlands, but also primarily to receive HS1. It wasn't called HS1 at the time. It was called CTRL, the Channel Tunnel Rail Link. But HS1 passes about, well, within 800 yards of my front door, and I hear Eurostar go by. When I first moved to this village and walked my dog in the field, Eurostar was using the ordinary rail line. It would leave Waterloo, but it didn't have a high-speed track to go on, so it would end up trundling along the ordinary rails. So finally, they opened the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, thanks to us shifting an awful lot of remains out of their way. And while we were doing this, we had all these bodies in the ground beneath us. And on the right, behind those arches, was a live railway, the Thameslink tunnel. It was all dangerous stuff. And the whole project, we're not talking about HS2 now, we're talking about 20 odd years ago. The whole project was broken down into a series of projects and awarded to different contractors, all the way from Folkestone to London. And this bit of the contract, my recollection was it 135 million or something crazy, just to do this little bit, as it were. And we did it, and it took 18 months, and now you've got St Pancras International looking very cool. So occasionally I go there and I feel, yeah, thank you very much. This is a job with which I've not been involved, and it marks a sea change. Mass exhumations, multiple mass exhumations like St Pancras, used to be done by mass exhumation companies. And St Pancras, the way it was done, outraged English heritage and all the rest of it. And the planning guidance legislation is always improving and changing. And now, essentially, I would say that if you're going to move a whole load of people for redevelopment, it has to be done by archaeologists and it has to be recorded. And recently I saw the repeats on BBC of Britain's biggest dig. And so this photograph was taken at the early stages because they haven't got very deep. But this is St James's Gardens next to Euston Station. And so they've exhumed, a lot. I think there was 60,000 people buried there. I visited the site to check it out while it was a green garden, but didn't get a look in, and I don't mind. I'm quite happy for archaeologists to be doing all of this now. This is another mass exhumation job in a delightful place in the centre of Salford. There's a ghastly shopping centre, but it looks like flats. It's because the flats are on top of the shopping centre. And there's a pavement and a road, and then there's a bit of grass at a slightly raised level. That bit of grass marks the site of an old nonconformist chapel with burials. And there we are, under the football pub, working with archaeologists. We actually did have records of who was buried there. And this was a very close community, these nonconformists, and they had 8 family members buried in each grave. And they went deep. And in fact, we exhumed a stillborn child who was stillborn in 1853 at 5 meters down. And we relocated everybody. And that mountain on the left is excavated spoil, which couldn't be moved off site until it was analysed to prove that it wasn't contaminated. So it was a nightmare really doing that job. We were there 13 weeks, did the whole job in 13 weeks and shifted, I think it was about 310, but slowly, as you can see. And if you go there today, that's what you see, an Asda store. This is a slightly blurry photograph of the inside of a Grade 1 listed church in Landen, which lost its roof thanks to Hitler's Luftwaffe in the war, and it just sat there in a ruin for a long time. And then the London Symphony Orchestra were looking for somewhere to expand from their base in the Barbican, and they wanted to make a place that they could use as a rehearsal centre, but also they wanted to use it as an education centre. Part of their remit is to educate the hoi polloi like you and me into music. And so they wanted to have the basement offices and all sorts of things. And of course, in the basement, there was a crypt, and the crypt, as I said before, is the same size as the church, but they wanted to extend into the churchyard. So again, we were there 18 months and shifted everybody out. And this is what an inside a crypt looks like. They used to use these crypts to put rubble from the bombing after the war, because there was tons of stuff. Bit blurry, but can you see the mess in the middle at the bottom there? That's all lead coffins twisted and bashed around with rubbish thrown on them. So we shifted everybody out, and this is what it looks like now. You'll be delighted to know it's got a roof. So the total cost of the whole job, I believe, was 21 million. And it's a fabulous place. It does what it says on the tin. It's marvelous. Oh, this ain't London. This is redevelopment, exhumation for redevelopment. If you go to sunny Luxor in Egypt and visit the Valley of the Kings, you might also visit, and you probably will, Luxor Temple and Karnak Temple. And as you can see, they're the sphinxes. And they're not as big as the sphinxes up at Giza where the pyramids are, but they're still pretty impressive. But it took a while for the penny to drop that there was a bit of an avenue of sphinxes at either temple, and it kind of disappeared. And there were all buildings, including mosques, schools, shops, houses. And the governor of Luxor, once he realized that this avenue runs all the way between the temples, he compulsorily purchased all of the land in between, booted everybody out, gave them inadequate compensation according to them. And I don't know the progress of that project now, but I got a call. I was minding my own business and got a call from the consul, the British consul in Cairo, who was very cautious, making sure he got the right person on the phone. And at the end of that conversation, I'd agreed, yeah, fine, yeah, send me the tickets, I'll come. And off I went to Egypt to shift bodies from a cemetery. Let me think about it. There were some local people there, Catholics. It's a Muslim country, but there was a minority of Catholics, but also any foreigners that died were buried in it. And we needed to move them, not because it was on the line of this avenue, but it was right next door. And he needed to build a bridge over the avenue, and the bridge needed support. So the avenue was pretty impressive, I have to say, and he knew it. Tourism is their biggest business. So there's not all of the sphinxes in place, but you can see they've now removed all the properties above, dug down, built the sides, and all the rest of it. So it's a major thing. And once a year, the big god at one end in one temple would be processed down the avenue to visit his girlfriend God in the other temple. That's as I understand it. Who's this? Howard Carter? No, it's me. And a couple of guys. So I dressed the part. And here we are in this rather pretty cemetery, smashing up the stones and moving the stones. As you can see, we had all high technology, everything at our disposal. And so I was working 7 days a week because some of my guys were Muslims and the exhumers were Catholics. So they wanted Sundays off. And it was hot, it was dusty. And the first day, their equivalent of the environmental health officer turned up and handed out some protective clothing, but didn't come again. And so we didn't bother with any of that nonsense. Here we are, as you can see, dressed to the gunnels in PPE. And I ordered body bags from a colleague in London. And I can remember sitting, it was often I feel my life, I'm in a movie. I mean, I have been in movies, in my TV documentaries, but some of the stuff I've done, I thought, is this real? So there I was, sat in the early hours of the morning in a grubby office at an airport with the fan turning slowly, but I could hardly see across the little room because it was so full of smoke, because everybody smokes out there. I had to sit there for hours breathing all this in, while the inscrutable official who held the fate of whether or not I'd get my body bags considered the matter. And I think we effectively bribed him, and I finally got my body bags, and off we went. And so we're out in the desert here, literally out in the desert, near a new city being built in the desert, creating a new cemetery, ready to receive these guys. The guy on the right is the vice consul from Cairo. He came down to see what was going on. The guy on the left is Egyptian, runs a business, a hotel and a shop, and he's the honorary British consul in Luxor. He's your man if you fall ill and you're British. And the other guys, there were some vaults in the original cemetery, so they were building new ones. And again, as you can see, health and safety is a priority here in Egypt. And there they are on the right, top right, you can see the vaults all completed. And these are after we'd reburied everybody. The governor of Luxor, he didn't look like Marlon Brando, but he acted like Marlon Brando in The Godfather. And he drove around, well, he was chauffeured around in his black limo with a fleet of black leather clad guys on big motorbikes. And I would go and see him. I'd get a call from him and I'd go and see him in the evenings in his office. And it was very much top dog, everybody bowing and scraping and minding their P&Qs in his presence. And he called me in and said, hey, so you've done the job. I said, yeah, great, we're finished. I did it in 3 weeks. And the first meeting I'd had with him was, hello, you're the guy who's going to do this. Yes, what do you need from me? And I said, well, I need men, I need vehicles, I need this, that, and the other. And so he supplied those. It wasn't quite as I expected, but it is a third world country. So at the end of it all, he said, right, what are we going to do then? I said, well, you need to do something. You need to have some kind of formal event to mark the fact the project's over. And he said, all right, what we'll do, he spoke very good English, what we'll do, because you've exhumed a whole load of foreigners, we will invite the ambassadors of all of the countries from whom these dead people have come. We'll invite them to the desert. And I said, yeah, and you'll have to give speeches. He said, now that's a good idea. You write my speech. So I wrote the speech for the governor of Luxor to deliver. And he did deliver my speech, but he also, what's the word, extemporate on it? He expanded upon it in perfect English. And so here we all are. The white guy in the suit in the middle front row is the English ambassador from Cairo. And the Cairo embassy is one of the most important British embassies in the world because it's in the Middle East and it's a hotbed of all sorts of things. The guy at the right with the pale tie is my friend Marlon. I've forgotten his name for a minute. That's the governor of Luxor at the time. And then the ladies on the left are some of the foreign ambassadors that came for the event. I can see me in there somewhere. Here is the British ambassador giving his speech in perfect Arabic. And there's me giving my speech in reasonably perfect English. And here we all are after the event. This is the tent that they constructed for the event. Okay, this is moving on to a bit of philosophy. Gilbert versus Buzzard and an other is a case brought in 1820 because at the time, as you know, there was grave robbing going on. So this guy, his wife died, and he thought, well, I don't want the grave diggers, grave robbers getting my wife's remains, Mary. I'll buy one of those newfangled iron coffins. That will protect her body. And when they arrived at the churchyard to bury her, the church warden said, Oi, is that one of those, I'm paraphrasing, Oi, is that one of them newfangled iron coffins? Well, yes, indeed, it is, my man. Well, you can't bury that in here, sir. We don't accept those. So they shoved Mary's coffin in the bone room in the church for 6 months while it all went to court. And Sir William Scott judged on this. And he said, these are very important words today in the context of the reuse of graves. A burial ground in a churchyard or a cemetery is not the property of one generation. Max, be quiet. It's not the property of one generation, those who are now dead. It is the common property of the living and of the generations yet unborn, and is subject only to temporary appropriations. That's a very powerful statement, saying that whatever your personal view is, a burial ground isn't always going to be exactly as it was the day they buried the last person in it. You can't reasonably just move on and build a new burial ground every time it gets full. It's a natural process of decomposition. Now, we Brits have a problem with that. They don't in France. This is in a cemetery in Paris, and there's a sign that's saying this grave's a bit of abandoned, and we're going to reclaim it. And if you've got any views on that, get hold of the superintendent, the conservateur of the cemetery. This is Hong Kong, a cemetery. And in the publicly owned cemeteries, they exhume everybody after 8 years. And because they think they're short of burial space. I did a report where I said, well, actually, you're not, but never mind. You have a choice. You don't have a choice about having your mum or dad. Bearing in mind something crazy like 98% of the population are cremated anyway. It's a relatively small proportion that choose burial, and it's expensive. So they know what's going to happen, that the burial is temporary. It's 8 years, and they only bury one person in a grave. After 8 years, you've got a choice. You can either get mum or dad's bones put in a pot, and you can bury them in a small plot, and then they can stay there forever, which is a bit bizarre. Or you get the bones cremated, and then they go in a niche, and they stay there forever. Again, that's not a sound practice, but never mind. This is Wohop Shek Cemetery, which is vast. You get the sense that it's vast from that photograph. And here we are. This is exhumation Hong Kong style. Not quite the way we do it here. They have these coffins, lotus coffins. I think they're shaped at the ends like a lotus flower, and they're seriously thick and heavy, solid wood. And there they are, secondhand, lying on the side, presumably going to be moved. And meanwhile, amongst all this debris, they are burying the next set of folks over there, as you can see. So you have to be broad-minded. This is New Southgate Cemetery in London. I actually conceived of the need for a private act because the people that own the cemetery said to me, we've got a problem, we're running out of space, what can we do about it? And I looked at it and said, right, you need a private act of parliament. And they said, can you do that? I said, okay, I'll do that. So I drafted the bill and then appointed the parliamentary agents whom you need to see these things through Parliament. And then after a few years, finally they got their act. So the act has granted permission for the cemetery to reuse graves where the last burial was more than 75 years ago. We've written to everybody. If you've got an interest, come and see us. And
I spoke at the ICCM events last week in London
oh yeah,
at the Gordon Museum, and you were discussed, not you personally, but New Southgate Cemetery and Crematorium, the reuse of graves. It was mentioned in their meeting, saying
oh
that they're hopeful that this rule will go across the whole UK soon, the whole of England. But there was just basically commending New Southgate for pushing this through as a separate entity. So I
yeah,
wasn't aware. I wasn't aware that you were behind that.
yeah. I was behind it. It was my literally my brainchild, and since then it's been copied. So Highgate have now got their own act, and in fact Bishop Stortford Town Council have gone for a private act. So people, naturally, it's not something that ordinary folks waste their time thinking about, but consultants like, well, me, I'm the one who's got all the knowledge about it all. What I did, there is legislation that enables local authorities in London to reuse graves. It's two pieces of legislation predominantly, and the problem with it is it's very limited. And in order to do it, you don't just put up a sign and start digging graves. There's a vast amount of work you have to do. And it's not straightforward. It's far more complex than anybody can possibly imagine. And the legislation limits what local authorities can do to the extent it's almost not worth trying. So I wrote the new Southgate Cemetery Act. I still had to use some of the legal gobbledygook, but I made it sensible so that, subject to doing everything in the right way, and I also wrote the conservation management plan for the cemetery. That took me months. Reusing graves isn't seen in isolation. It has to be seen in the historical and architectural and emotional side context. So I had a lot to do with that. I also did some test digs in an area of the cemetery to see, where people were and what condition they were in and that sort of thing. And it's been very successful. I think I've got a photograph. That's the area where I did the test digs, waiting for burials. And the last time I was there, it was full of stones and full of graves. So it's providing new burial space. And that is essential. And the legislation, you can't wait for the government to do something. Local authorities themselves got together to do the London Local Authorities Act 2007. Is quite a big act with all sorts of stuff like the Local Government Act 1972. It's not about reuse of graves, it's about all sorts of local government functions. It's only section 74 that deals with the reuse of graves, and it's quite short. But that, I believe, came about because local authorities thought, well, we need various powers to do various things. Let's gang together and do it. The government sits on its hands. The government won't do anything. And so, if a town council realises this and is willing to pay, it's not cheap to have a private act, and you're taking a risk you're not going to get it. If they're willing to do it, it just shows it is the one and only way to go. Oh, we've got a long section without photographs now about legal requirements. So if you're digging up an individual, there's various legal requirements that apply, and it all depends on the circumstances. You might use a coroner's direction. It used to be called a warrant. You may use an exhumation license issued by the Ministry of Justice or a faculty issued by the Chancellor of the Diocese. So coroner's direction, that's under the Coroners and Justice Act 2009. A senior coroner may order an exhumation of a person's body. And if he does, he may issue a direction to exhume a body. And if he's going to issue a direction, it must be in Form 4, and here's Form 4. I've been informed the body of X has been buried here, rah-de-rah-de-rah. I direct you to allow the body to be exhumed. Now, this doesn't overrule the faculty of jurisdiction. If you've got a case where you're investigating a death and you've got a coroner's warrant, you still have to let the local diocesan registrar know. He flags it up to the chancellor, and they usually say, oh, fair enough, if you're doing it under the license of the direction of a coroner, we accept that that's got to be done, and yes, you've got our blessing. Now, there used to be a lot of confusion about whether you need a license or a faculty. And the Burial Act 1857, section 25, was amended in 2015 to make it simpler. The actual words of the amendment are really complicated, and I wish they had been simpler, but they have been amended. And the effect of all of that is, if it's consecrated ground, which is land consecrated by a bishop of the Church of England in a formal service. It's not achieved by a vicar saying a prayer. This is a special thing that has legal consequences. If it's consecrated ground, you only need a faculty, regardless of where the body's going to go. In the old days, you need a license as well if you were going to rebury them in unconsecrated ground, which was a nonsense. So you just need a faculty. If it's unconsecrated, you need a license. And the application form for a Ministry of Justice license is very helpful. It clearly states there, meaning consecrated means a burial ground that's been sanctified or made holy in accordance with the rites of the Church of England, not the Roman Catholic Church, not the Methodists, the Wesleyans, or whoever. It's Church of England only. And it does not mean ground blessed during a funeral service. And very clearly, ground consecrated by the Roman Catholic Church, the Church in Wales, or any other religious denomination does not have the same legal effect as ground consecrated by the Church of England. So you need a faculty. Right, on again. This is again off the Ministry of Justice application form. It's there clearly for people to see what you need when you need it. Now then, in 2019, there was this particular case heard by the Chancellor of the Diocese of Southwell and Nottingham, where there was an exhumation. And I love this one. The Worshipful Mark Ockleton, MABD, the Chancellor of the Diocese, who's a terribly important person, said, "None of the professionals in the story come out well. I hope you funeral directors are squirming in your seats, waiting for you to be lambasted. You will be." Here we go. The Ministry of Justice has failed to keep its website and forms up to date. They have updated them, which is what I just showed you. But at the time, although in particular it's failed to implement an important change in the law nearly 5 years ago, so their forms are unhelpful, don't ask the right questions, and the official at the ministry who issued the license did so when he had in front of him the information that he had no jurisdiction to do so. It's a Church of England churchyard. He shouldn't have issued the license. So the Ministry of Justice completely failed. The incumbent, the vicar, failed. Apparently did not read the form she was asked to endorse and sign, did not raise any question about why a license, not a faculty, was being applied for, and didn't make any further inquiries when she was told of the impending exhumation, for which there had been no faculty that she had supported or of which she was aware. I mean, she should have been aware. Oh, the funeral directors apparently did not suspect that a churchyard was consecrated. A bit sarcastic there. Or did not ask whether it was, or did not know that an exhumation from consecrated land requires a faculty. So any funeral directors who don't already know, that are listening to this, now know. And it's very important to know. So in Wales, it's a tricky one. Consecrated by the Church of Wales doesn't have the same power, so you don't need a faculty. The Church in Wales think you do. And you would, if it were consecrated by the Church of Wales, you'd probably out of politeness apply to them, and they consider the matter and all the rest of it. But if they did issue you with a faculty and you went and exhumed the person, you'd actually be breaking the law, the Burial Act 1857, section 25, because you didn't have a license, because the consecration by the Church in Wales does not carry any legal authority. Scotland, as we mentioned before, it's the sheriff that licenses exhumations. In future, that may change. Northern Ireland, it's issued by the Department for Communities. That's under that particular piece of legislation. If you're doing multiple exhumations, you might do them with the faculty. If it's a churchyard, I've shown you a photograph of a church extension and we exhume people. That was all done under a faculty. Then there's a minefield, the law. So there's different bits of legislation that apply under different circumstances. So the Mission and Pastoral Measure 2011, the Disused Burial Grounds Amendment Act 1981 applies to unconsecrated ground. I've shifted an awful lot of people under that. There's other things too, the Town and Country Planning Act 1990, where a local authority takes on an old burial ground and decides it needs to be redeveloped. If it is, that's redeveloped under the Town and Country Planning, Churches, Places of Religious Worship and Burial Grounds Regulations 1950 that trips off the tongue. Or you might have a private act of Parliament. I'm not talking here about the new Southgate Cemetery Act. I'm talking about the Channel Tunnel Rail Link Act 1996, by which I exhumed St Pancras. The Crossrail Act 2008, which required exhumations. Again, I wasn't involved in those. And the High Speed Rail Act 2017, by which they have exhumed St James's Garden by Euston and a large cemetery in Birmingham and some other burial grounds on the way. So that's the legal side of it. There's another legal side of it. There's also common sense side of it. If you're not aware of this document, you should be when it comes to being a funeral director, because it's guidance for the mortuary, post-mortem room and funeral premises and during exhumation. So they were going to do a separate thing on exhumation and they decided to bag it with this. And then after they should have done, they reviewed it and slightly modified it. And I remember I was speaking at a conference, and so I sat in on the session before me, and it was two people from the HSE saying, hey guys, we've published this revised guidance of this document, and they gave a rather dull presentation about that. Then they sat down and I got up and waffled about exhumation. And when I was having my refreshment in the break afterwards, there's a tap on my shoulder and they said to me, oh, we think we should have spoken to you, shouldn't we, before we did our revisions. So I then made some comments for them, in writing later about the revisions, and they were incorporated it. But this document is what you need. And there you go. I finally finished. My hour's presentation lasted 2 hours, and I hope that you found it insightful. I hope, I forgot to say at the beginning, I hope that I caused no offence whatsoever. I hope that I did not give any impression of treating the matter with undue levity. One has to maintain one's sanity dealing with difficult things in all areas of life. Exhumation is difficult on lots of different levels. It can be extremely difficult physically, in particular the condition of the deceased. But as we've discussed, or as I've waffled about, it's very delicate with bereaved people, whether they're attending or not. If you're doing something in your job and you ask yourself, if I had a member of the family, somebody who loved this person, if they were stood there looking over my shoulder, watching what I were doing, would I still carry on doing it? Would I feel comfortable about what I'm doing? If the answer to that question is, well, actually, no, I wouldn't feel comfortable, then I suggest to you, you should rethink what you're doing. And that applies with exhumation, whether the family are in attendance or not, however challenging the ground conditions are, the weather, the fact it's dark, the state of the coffin, the state of the body, you still have to behave as if the spouse or the child of this person is there watching you. You have to behave as if it's your loved one whoever they are, that's what you have to do. So on that happy note, I will close this session.
Peter, thank you so much. I think it's incredible what you do, and you mentioned about that respect, and I think it's really clear. I think it's clear that you get a lot of fulfillment out of helping people doing a really difficult challenge. So thank you on behalf of society for doing what you do, because it feels very complex, but you seem to get into these places and out of these places, sent to Egypt and all over the world doing this stuff. I think it's really important what you do. So thank you so much, Peter. It's been really interesting. I've had to really keep my mouth shut because I have so many questions for you. We need to go for a beer and discuss it further, because I've got so many questions to ask you. But thank you so much, Peter. Fantastic.
I would be delighted to have that discussion with you.
Wonderful. Okay, Peter. Well, thanks so much. I'll stop recording now. One moment. Stop recording.